Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 29 of the Ask Historians podcast. So, if you recall, dear listener, back in episode 18, we had our current guest for both this episode and that episode, who is a PhD student in Bible stuff, come and talk to us about the textual history of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And at that time, I had suggested to him, well, we had both kind of been chatting about how great it'd be if we just kind of, instead of doing a broad overview, went and delved into one book in particular. Here we are. We will be going through the book of Daniel today, which is one of the kind of books at the end of the Old Testament. So if you started reading and got put off by the then guy beget another guy, and then a guy beget another guy, and you kind of put down the Bible at that point, and didn't skip ahead to the good parts. This is one of the good parts. It's one of the more quotable and notable, I guess you could say, the parts of the Bible. You'll see that we bring up a lot of kind of interesting phrases like, Daniel in the lion's den, the writing on the wall, things like that. You're buying time. These are all very pithy little statements within this book. But the book itself is very interesting in other ways as well, being kind of a prophecy after the fact that Husky will bring up a few times. But it's a very interesting episode. I love textual analysis and all these things that go into it, and kind of taking historical works apart to see what they meant in the context of their time, and also how they've been interpreted over time, and also kind of what we can really learn, and what the main thrust of what the actual writing was based on kind of the context clues in the writing itself. So I loved these things, clearly. But so if you want to skip around a little bit, this is it's going to be a two-parter. In this first part, we're really going to go through kind of situating the book itself, the book of Daniel itself, within the larger context of the Hebrew Bible, and then kind of talking about the timing of when it was written and the timing of when it purports to be written. And so that's about the first, say, 13 minutes here, and that covers the first two chapters as well. Then we'll skip ahead to about chapter 3 around the minute 30 mark, and then chapter 4 about 38 minutes in. Chapter 5 about 45 minutes in, and then chapter 6 about 51 minutes in, and then finally about an hour and 2 minutes in, we'll close out with chapter 7. So for those of you who want to skip around at home, those are your very vague time markers. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into this. Again, we'll be basically going chapter by chapter in this episode, and then in part 2 we'll take it a bit more in broad strokes and talk about some of the Apocrypha and the historiography of the book of Daniel. So enjoy.
Welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians Podcast. Today I'm here with, I believe, our first returning guest, Husky54 on the Ask Historians subreddit. And today, previously we talked kind of in general about the Hebrew Bible, but today we're going to focus in on one book in particular, and that is the book of Daniel. But Husky, before we get into that, would you go ahead and tell us a little bit about your background, so we know that you were just not some person I pulled off the street?
Sure. So when we left our hero several months ago with the first episode, I was prepping for my comprehensive exams as a part of my PhD work, and I've now cleared the comprehensive exams and am now a dissertator in the field of Hebrew Bible and Northwest Semitic philology, epigraphy, paleography, a little bit of Syro-Palestinian Levantine archaeology. But primarily, I make my home in Hebrew Bible, so with a few related degrees that came along before the PhD began.
So we're going to be focusing on one particular book in the Old Testament, as I think most people know it. But because we are going to be approaching this, we're also going to be talking about kind of some of the chapters in this book, which is the book of Daniel, which are kind of apocryphal in some areas, and of course, and accepted in others, such as the stories about such as dragons and things. But before we get into that, this is Daniel's part of the Hebrew Bible, which is called the Ketuvim. This is the K in the Tanakh. So go ahead and tell us what that group of books is and how Daniel fits into it.
Sure. So of course, you've already mentioned the acronym Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. The K in this acronym, the word Ketuvim, is just the Hebrew word for written things. It's a passive participle. We in English often refer to it as the writings. The things that you'll find in this section of the Hebrew Bible range from Psalms to Proverbs, the book of Job. We get books like Esther. We get Daniel, of course, the focus of our talk here today. First and Second Chronicles are in the Ketuvim. We also get Ezra and Nehemiah. So it's kind of a smattering of texts that don't fit in the Torah being Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and also don't really fit in the Nevi'im or the prophets. So we have things like Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and then, of course, all the classical prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Hosea, Jonah, Malachi, all of those, both larger and smaller books.
It feels like it's a bit kind of like the miscellaneous section of the Bible. Like, well, this doesn't really fit anywhere else, so let's just kind of group them together at the end.
To a certain extent, sure, yeah.
Yeah. So how does Daniel actually relate to some of the other books in the Ketuvim?
Daniel stands on its own merit. And so if we want to take the Reverend Child's tack and talk about canonical criticism, which is kind of how we're starting here, Daniel falls in between Esther and Ezra and Nehemiah. And a lot of stuff in the Ketuvim tends to have to do with things like Second Temple Judaism. So a lot of stuff that's happening after the return from the Babylonian exile. So we're dealing late 6th century BCE at the earliest with a lot of this stuff. Oftentimes, significant portions of it are being written and collected and things like that much later, even into the Roman period to a certain extent. But more so, Daniel specifically dealing with a lot of things in the Hellenistic period and Persian period. You
brought the Hellenistic and the Persian period. So when are we actually seeing or at least when do we think that the first earliest writings of what will become Daniel were written? And also, Daniel is also kind of it's kind of a bifurcated book, in which case it's kind of some portions may have been written at one time and some portions may have been written at another. So what is the time span there as well?
There are a lot of different theories about this, and a big part of how different people approach it depends on their background. So more confessional individuals, more conservative individuals who like to hold to more traditional dates, they want to put Daniel in the 6th century. They want to locate Daniel in Babylon as this courtier of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon during the Babylonian exile. It's this very trusting approach to the biblical text. It seems more likely, however, that portions of it, like the latter half, so chapters 8 through 12, were probably written last, and we're talking like 2nd century CE, so around the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who's this Greek ruler who's meting out all kinds of oppression on the Jewish people in the Levant, and is kind of one of the sources for or instigators for what eventually becomes the celebration of Hanukkah. And then we have the first half of the book in chapters 1 through 7, most of which was probably written much earlier. And by much, I mean a couple of centuries, and possibly only even one. But the Aramaic portions and chapter 1, which is also in Hebrew, were most likely written probably during the 3rd century, or at least were being compiled in the 3rd century, something along those lines. The dating of biblical texts can get very tricky, especially with one like this, partially because we have this character Daniel, who appears in a number of other places, not just in the book of Daniel, but we get a reference to him in Ezekiel 14:14, and he's mentioned in conjunction with Noah and Job, and we get him in Ezekiel 28:3 as this prototype of wisdom. But they're not to, like, these references in Ezekiel are not to Daniel in this book of Daniel that we're talking about today, but to this kind of folkloristic hero, who has roots as far back as the Middle Bronze Age. At Ugarit, we have these texts about this guy named Don Ale. And so that could be, a conversation for another day. But
so we have this kind of almost kind of Johnny Appleseed folk hero who pops up in numerous kind of ways, who gets his own book in a way. But I'm glad you brought up the fact that this is Hebrew and Aramaic, because it is, I believe, one of the books that kind of switches in between that. And does that itself give us a clue to when some of these portions were written? I mean, just in the fact that both it's using Hebrew and Aramaic, and perhaps also the type of Hebrew, or the type of Aramaic, or the idioms that are being used, or the words.
Yeah, one of the ways that we can go about assessing this data is, so we have different dialects of Aramaic, and Aramaic, like any language, evolves over time. And so, like, if you and I were to sit down and read Chaucer in the original Middle English, it would look significantly different from the English that you and I are speaking now. The same thing with Beowulf. If we went back and read Beowulf, due diligence to Tolkien, whose birthday was just the other day, Old English looks so different from what you and I speak today. We would have to take classes just to be able to read Old English. So Aramaic evolves kind of similarly insofar as we can talk about Old Aramaic. So Old Aramaic from the first half of the first millennium BCE, but more so like the first quarter even. And then we see certain linguistic changes as the language develops and evolves and things like that. So we get spellings of words change slightly. So in Old Aramaic, for example, we have the word for land as arqa, which later becomes ar'a. And so we can date a text by means of linguistic data such as that. And so we're dealing with what we call Imperial Aramaic in the book of Daniel. And so Imperial Aramaic really comes to the fore. We can probably start talking about it around 700 BCE, and then it lives on for several centuries, and we find evidence of it at Elephantine. We get it in the Bible in both Daniel and the book of Ezra, and a few other places outside the biblical text as well. So that's just for the Aramaic, and the Aramaic in Daniel, just to get some specifics here, goes from verse 2:4 through 7:28. So that's the range of Aramaic within Daniel. Of course, we're working with 12 chapters of text here. The Hebrew, on the other hand, is very distinct. And so if we're going to think about Daniel as this character who's couched in the Babylonian exile, or the narrative context, rather, we should say, the narrative world of the text suggests that Daniel is in the Babylonian exile. And if that's the case, we would expect the Hebrew portions to reflect that. But the Hebrew portions don't look anything like the Hebrew of the 6th century. And so we might look at Jeremiah as an analog. Jeremiah was probably working during the 6th century, and probably early 6th century, and is talking about the beginning of the exile with Nebuchadnezzar and things like that. But the Hebrew in Jeremiah and the Hebrew in Daniel look markedly different. And so there are certain things about the syntax, there are certain things about vocabulary usage, and again, spelling too comes to the fore as well, that tell us that we are dealing with what's called late biblical Hebrew, or LBH.
So just to play a little devil's advocate, or whatever the phrase is in Aramaic, could it be possible that this was a 6th century BC text or a 5th century BC text, something closer to the time period that it is portrayed as actually happening in, that we simply just don't have the earlier records for it, and it was maybe copied down later or passed down through several ways? I mean, do we have very, very early physical copies of the Book of Daniel?
The earliest stuff that we have for almost any biblical text is going to come from Qumran, from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And at the earliest, the Dead Sea Scrolls are going to date to sometime during the 3rd century, but much of them, or most of them, are probably going to be dated later than that. We have very little outside that hails from, or can be, that we can date securely to any time earlier than that. So as far as the evidence that we have that's extant for the Book of Daniel, and we're looking at things like Papyrus 967, 4Q, Prayer of Nabonidus, the Nabonidus Chronicle, things like that, and then various Greek recensions or Greek versions of Daniel. We don't have anything that hails from the 6th century BCE specifically, and we don't have any. We certainly have records of characters or people, historical personages like Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar and things like that, and even a Darius, and we'll talk about that name in a little bit. We know that many people are historical personages themselves, but we don't have records of these things from Babylon, right? From Babylonian annals or anything like that.
So with these early kind of Dead Sea Scroll, or very, very early physical biblical texts, we can at least look at them and say, well, these are written at the same time. These Dead Sea Scrolls, early texts, and we do see that marked difference, implying that at least one was faithfully copied down in that kind of older Aramaic. This one is clearly written in a more kind of modern or maybe not modern, but at least a more recent Aramaic.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah, and it can be really tricky to try and talk about original pristine texts. And Emmanuel Tove, in his volume on textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible, has a decent discussion of this problem of the formation of books of the Bible and when these things come together. But if we're thinking about a text that was maybe written down originally, like at an earlier period, we would expect those earlier grammatical, syntactical, linguistic features to be maintained. Certainly some updating would happen, and we see evidence of that elsewhere, where scribes are wont to come along and occasionally will update a text to cohere more cogently with how they understand the grammar and syntax of the language. But even still, at least with the Aramaic, Imperial Aramaic has a decent lifespan of a solid couple of centuries. And so since we're dealing with Imperial Aramaic in the 6th century BCE, more broadly conceived, that is to say that Imperial Aramaic was the form of Aramaic used during the 6th century, and that Imperial Aramaic is the brand or style of Aramaic that appears in Daniel, we can't necessarily exclude it on the basis of the Aramaic, that the Aramaic sections weren't written in the 6th century. We have other data to push things to downdate the text in that regard. But the Hebrew is definitively late, and the characteristics of the Hebrew, there would need to be a significant amount of updating and things like that. And then on top of the fact that we also have a lot of Persian loanwords, we have Greek loanwords, we have all these loanwords from other languages that really only come to the fore or come to prominence later.
Yeah, so why don't we go ahead and just I actually have some more questions about when we get to kind of some of the more text or chapters that are kind of apocryphal and different faiths, but questions about those. But I think we might want to move into the actual content of the book of Daniel at this point, because when we talk about it, it will become very, very clear for those of you who are not familiar with the book of Daniel why the dating of this book is so important, because it does set itself in a very historical time in kind of a prophecy way. So I've been calling it, kind of in background with you, Daniel's Awesome Dream Journal, because I have it on good authority that I am a terrible person. But, it is set out in a way of, a lot of the kind of structure is someone has a dream, Daniel or someone else interprets the dream. If it's someone else's dream, Daniel interprets it. If it's Daniel's dream, then, he interprets it, or, he gets divine interpretation there. So why don't you just go ahead and kind of lead us through the book of Daniel and kind of tell us what it says and why this has kind of lasted through the centuries, because it does have some very pithy phrases, the writings on the wall in the lion's den, things like that. So.
Yeah. So one of the problems that I'll say before I really get into kind of a general outline with Daniel is we kind of have a sort of hodgepodge of literary genre, and so genre tends, or in some cases can overlap and things like that. So some of the genres that we'll be dealing with as far as the literature here is concerned are apocalyptic literature, some prophecies kind of in there, vision reports. We also have some like court contests. We have this trope of the success of the Jew in the foreign court, which we'll talk about in a minute. But yeah, so the overall structure, and here I'm going to riff off of John Gammey's kind of outline, and he wrote a solid article a number of years ago in the Journal of Biblical Literature, and that's going to be volume 95, number 2 in 1976. So a little dated, but still helpful to be sure. He kind of breaks the outline down like this, and so we start off with chapter 1. Chapter 1 is where we meet our hero for the first time, and we find that these young lads are being trained, Daniel and his friends are being trained in the court of King Nebuchadnezzar. And so they're in Babylon, and they're these Jews in exile.
Yeah, and it actually starts off with the first couple lines are Nebuchadnezzar coming over and capturing Jerusalem, destroying the temple, and starting the Babylonian exile.
Right. So our very first verse, Bishnat Shalosh Lamalkut Yehoiakim Melech Yehuda. So in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Ba Nebuchadnezzar, Melech Bavel Yerushalayim Vayatzar Aleha. So Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, entered Jerusalem and laid siege against it. So verse 1 is its own historical problem, which we can talk about in a little bit. But that sets our scene. So we're dealing with Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian exile, which the date that pretty much everyone has agreed upon for the beginning of the exile is 586 or 587 BCE. but we can talk more about the historical problems later. So Daniel and his friends, they come into the court of the king, and they're being trained in the ways of Babylonian courtiers, but at the same time are refraining from eating any of the food of the king. So we have some concerns here dealing with identity, Jewish identity in what we call the diaspora. So they're not in the land, right? They're not in the Levant, or they're not in Israel. They're in Babylon, and they're dealing with how to handle their own identity as Jews in a foreign land. And so one of the ways that they do that is in the way that they eat. So we have that in chapter 1 that sets up kind of a lot of what follows. Chapter 2 is where we get our transition into Aramaic. And so here we see all these different kinds of magicians and courtiers and things like that. These Khartoumim for one of the roles here, and the Chaldeans and astrologers. So you get all these different people who are coming to Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar has had this dream, and he's troubled by this dream, and he wants an interpretation, but he refuses to tell any of his counselors. So then he makes this decree to kill all the wise men in Babylon, and then they happen to find Daniel, who goes and presents an interpretation.
And just to be clear, this is the wise men who are unable to interpret his dream that he won't tell them.
Right. Yeah. So Nebuchadnezzar is kind of setting them up to fail, right? So he expects his counselors to be able to not only interpret the dream, but to tell him the dream without Nebuchadnezzar telling them the dream in the first place.
Yeah, and I reread Daniel in kind of preparation for this. In my trusty old New International Version, which you can scoff at. I'm sure you're a Bible snob, but
no scoffing. To be sure. Every translation has its merits.
So, and there's a very interesting passage where Nebuchadnezzar says, okay, brings the astrologers and wise men in and says, okay, interpret my dreams, and the astrologers say, well, tell your servants, and then we'll interpret it from there. And he basically says, quit stalling and interpret my dream. And then they are forced to admit that we can't do it, at which point, that triggers well, I guess I'll put you all to death.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And so you get these great turns of phrases, in the Aramaic, where the king is like, I can tell that and the phrase is basically literally that you're buying time. So yeah, it turns into this death sentence for all the sages, or all the wise men in throughout Babylon. And so they go to gather up all the wise men to kill them, and they happen upon Daniel, who then says, wait, time out, bring me before the king, and I'll handle it, I'll take care of it.
Yeah. And who is Daniel at this point in kind of the narrative of the book of Daniel?
At this point, he's really just this kind of young Hebrew lad, and which will come up later when we talk about historical problems. So Daniel, presumably these kids in the court of the king who are learning the ways of Babylon and things like that, and refusing to eat the food of the king, presumably these are probably 12, 13-year-old kids, maybe a little older, maybe a little younger. There's a bit of a range there, to be sure, but so he's a boy, more or less.
But he's also, he's like an expat. He's hanging out in the royal court of Nebuchadnezzar. He's not taken away to Babylon to be a slave.
Right. And so and presumably, if we think about what the exile was in the Levant, the people who were carried off from the land it wasn't the whole populace, like a lot of people seem to think, which is an easy assumption to make. But really, when the Babylonians went into the Levant, they only really took the elites. They took the priests and the officials and the ruling class, because they didn't really care about the lower classes, because, who were they? Babylon really cared about taking over, right? And
you people who, farm things, stay there, keep farming things, because we're going to need that. You people who rule things, why don't you come with us?
Right. And so we have Daniel, who, if he's in the exile, was presumably party to some kind of Israelite aristocracy, if we can use that anachronism. So he's now being trained in the ways of Babylon, and apparently has the ability to not only interpret the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, but can report the dream as well, which makes him stand apart from his Babylonian counterparts. And what this kind of plays into this trope of the success of the Jew in the foreign court. So we have this Jewish guy in this foreign land in the diaspora who is succeeding in the court of the king, and we see analogs in, like, say, the Joseph story. So for those of you who remember the Joseph story, of course, we have this young Israelite boy who's taken down to Egypt and is sold into the house of Pharaoh, and rises to prominence as what? As an interpreter of dreams. And so he rises to success in the house of Pharaoh, and ends up overseeing, according to the text, of course, and not making any historical statements here, just reporting the text. According to the text, of course, Joseph comes to oversee almost everything in the land of Egypt. And so,
while wearing an amazing Technicolor coat, I believe, right? Very well.
Well, interestingly as well, the Hebrew actually says it's just a coat with long tails. So I hate to burst everybody's musical bubbles, but there's no Technicolor dream coat. It's just a coat with long tails.
I mean, at least he's in a tux. So,
well, sure.
So what is this dream? Because Daniel does finally go to bring us back to the narrative. Daniel does eventually go to Nebuchadnezzar and says, "I can reveal this." Well, he doesn't says that he can interpret the dream. I believe he says that that God will interpret the dream, and then Daniel will just kind of relay it. Yeah.
Right, and that's a big part of it too, because one of the things that we'll see throughout this text is that one of the contrasts that's being set up by all this stuff, by the works of Daniel and even the additions to Daniel and things like that, is that it's Yahweh, the God of Israel, the God of Daniel's ancestors, who is the one who's able to work and to do things, as opposed to the gods of Babylon and things like that. So, okay, so we're in the middle of chapter 2 here, and this Babylonian official Arioch takes Daniel from his house after we get this nice little prayer from Daniel, and brings him to the court of the king. And so we get in 226, and the king said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, so we have keep that in mind, Belteshazzar, there's a T in there, as opposed to Belshazzar, which will come up later. And so the king asks Daniel if he's able to interpret the dream, without even telling him the dream again. So we have this theme here. And of course Daniel cites the God in heaven who is able to reveal mysteries. Basically what comes up here is this end of days phrase, right? And we get things that are going to be happening in the future. And so what we might call Vaticanea ex eventu, so this prophecy after the fact, is probably what's going on here.
Although presented as prophecy at the time.
Oh, for sure. So, because what Daniel is playing into here is this trend during the Second Temple, where you would have this folkloristic Johnny Appleseed type figure who would be cited for their kind of trans-historical authority, and they would be able to construct these texts that were then more authoritative because of this connection with this historical figure or folkloristic figure. And so that's kind of how this text gains a lot of momentum.
In the same way that people today will say, "Oh no, this is assign a modern quote to like Benjamin Franklin or Mark Twain or someone in a way."
Sure, and of course we've seen similar things with memes with Taylor Swift and Adolf Hitler quote.
So what is the dream?
Right. So the dream. This is the dream. This is the vision of the statue, and so in this dream, Nebuchadnezzar sees this massive, massive statue, and it's composed of all kinds of different materials. So from the head to the toe, the head is made of gold, the chest and the arms are made of silver, its kind of belly area and its thighs are made of bronze, its legs, so I would imagine from the knees down, are made of iron, and the feet are mixed both iron and clay. And so each of these pieces of the statue represent different kingdoms. Okay, a big part of this is how the author here is perceiving the succession of world powers, and that's a kind of a big theme throughout the book, is this progression of Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece. Rome is not a part of this. We need to leave Rome out of the equation. So some people will think that Rome is the fourth kingdom here in the or fourth empire in this Aramaic section of Daniel, but it's not. And so basically what Daniel is telling Nebuchadnezzar, excuse me, that's a tricky name sometimes, is that his kingdom is going to pass from him, it's going to be, things are going to get split up basically, right? And so we get in 244, and in the days of those kings, that is the kings that come after Nebuchadnezzar, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall this kingdom be left to another people. It shall crush all these kingdoms and bring them to an end. It shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from the mountain, so part of this dream is this mountain this stone that's not cut by human hands is thrown against the statue, heaved against the statue, and crushes it. So just as you saw that, so back in 245 here, just as you saw that a stone was cut from the mountain not by hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, and the silver, and the gold, the great God has informed the king what shall be hereafter. The dream is certain, and its interpretation trustworthy.
Yeah, so this is kind of the first of, and we see this again and again through all the dreams that get interpreted, kind of the first of saying, okay, like, yes, there's a kingdom, and then there'll be more kingdoms, but eventually there'll be this, and I don't think this phrase is ever actually used in the Book of Daniel itself, but what we would call, the kingdom of heaven or something like that, the righteous, or, and I guess at this point they would really be kind of completely synonymizing that with the kind of restoration of the state of Israel, the state of Judea, whatever they were particularly envisioning at that point, the restoration of kind of a Hebrew state.
The province of Yehud might be a nice way of doing that.
That seems way too fancy for me, but
well, the kingdom of heaven, of course, is a very Matthean. If we can tap into a little bit of New Testament here, it's a very Matthew type phrase, but yeah, to a certain extent, that's kind of what Daniel is hinting at, that the foreign powers, the foreign empires that were in charge over of the Levant for such a lengthy period of time will eventually be put to the side by the God of Yehud, or the God of Israel. And of course, we have a lot of what we call like Hasmonean interests throughout the book. So we're dealing with Maccabees, so Judah Maccabee and the Maccabean revolt, and Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, and this is the first half of the 2nd century BCE, so around 167, 164. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of this is looking toward a time of, you could say, Jewish independence from these world empires.
To return to the narrative, Daniel correctly interprets the dream, or he correctly narrates the dream and then gives his interpretation. So, what is Nebuchadnezzar's response to this? I would assume most people, for those of you who are not familiar with the Book of Daniel but are familiar with Daniel being the lion's den, I'm sure every time we finish a sentence, you're thinking, okay, so then he goes in the lion's den, right? But no, this doesn't happen at this point, does it?
Right. So after Daniel interprets this dream, it basically says, look, these kingdoms are all going to pass away. Nebuchadnezzar then falls on his face and like worships Daniel and gives him all kinds of gifts and things like that. It's kind of quite the opposite reaction, it seems, from what we might expect. But at the same time, Daniel starts out the dream, you, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory. So we have this Jew ascribing all this might and power to this foreign king.
But also kind of saying, yeah, but eventually your kingdom will fall, in a way.
Right.
You're a very powerful king now, but I'm prophesying. Well, I don't know if this would be correctly be called prophesying at this point. Dream interpretation. I mean, or vision reporting. Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, he's like, you're the head of gold. So he's putting Nebuchadnezzar above all these other kings. But at the same time, they all get crushed by this mountain. And then Nebuchadnezzar turns around and worships Daniel, gives him all these gifts, and then, interestingly enough, more or less kind of converts, because in 247 we get Nebuchadnezzar saying, truly your God is the God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. And then Daniel gets promoted, and again we see his success of this Jew in the foreign court, to the extent that the Babylonian king is seemingly converting to Judaism. Is kind of what it seems. Yeah, and then which of course happened, obviously. But and then in chapter 3, we see Nebuchadnezzar, to move a little forward in the narrative. We see him kind of deciding to honor Daniel in a way. So could you tell us what the narrative says that the next step that he takes then?
Yeah, 3 is a little different, because we kind of have it's kind of a scene shift, and so we can kind of close curtain on chapter 2 and then open curtain for a new scene in chapter 3 here, and we get this golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar has made. Imagine just a huge 60 cubit high, 6 cubit wide statue that's set up in the plain of Dura in Babylon, and he sets out this decree that at the sound of all these instruments and all this music, that everyone should bow down and pay homage to this to this statue.
It's this golden idol, which has a long and very happy history in Jewish history, of course.
Well, in various forms, to be sure, yeah. And so what ends up happening is you have these kind of tattletale courtiers who go to Nebuchadnezzar and say, "O king, there are a handful of people from the province of Yehud on the other side of the river who are not bowing down and worshiping at the sound of all this music." And in chapter 3 here, Daniel kind of takes the back seat because he's not really part of the narrative in chapter 3. It's really about these other three guys, Rakshak and Benny. We can refer to them affectionately. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Here after Rakshak and Benny, just because it's fun.
Yeah, and who are these three?
Yeah, these are three friends of Daniel, basically. And so they're presumably three more Jews in exile. And they also have Hebrew names. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be their Babylonian names. Okay. Abednego is probably actually really Abd Nabu, which means servant of Nabu. Nabu being one of the deities in the Babylonian pantheon. And of course, for a good Jewish text, you can't have a servant of Nabu. So his name gets changed to Abed, A-B-E-D, Abednego. So, but they also have Hebrew names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they refuse to bow down to this statue, and the failures from chapter 2, namely the magicians and the Chaldeans and things like that, they go back to Nebuchadnezzar and say, "O king, we have these guys who aren't bowing down to the statue. What do you want us to do with them?" So they bring Rakshak and Benny to the court of the king, and then they cast them into this fiery furnace. So this of course is another one of the famous kind of scenes from this book. These three guys walking around in the furnace. And what ends up happening is that only three are cast down into this furnace, and when they cast them into the furnace, they're bound up, they're tied up, and they're wearing some kind of outfit of Mesopotamian garb, which is
they don't have any particular fire protection going on, I think is the
right. They're not wearing
asbestos robes.
Exactly. And so after they're cast into the furnace, they and interestingly enough, so the servants of the king throw the three friends into the furnace, and as soon as they do, the fire leaps up from inside the furnace and kills these guys. Not Rakshak and Benny, but the guys who threw them in are killed by the flames in the furnace. Rakshak and Benny are then walking around in the furnace, and they can see them walking around, and all of a sudden there's this fourth person who appears in the furnace. One like a son of man, I believe, is the phrase, or one like the son of God, one of the two. Off the top of my head, I'm blanking. I'm sorry about that. And they're walking around unscathed. So they bring them out of the furnace, and they notice that not even a single hair on their head was singed. And as a result, we see a similar kind of outcome at the end of chapter 3, where Nebuchadnezzar makes this decree, and we see in chapter 3:29, or Daniel 3:29, "Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb," and one of my favorite curses, "and their houses laid in ruins, but really it's made into a pile of dung. For there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way."
Yeah. So when I read that, I think what it struck to me, and you're the biblical scholar here, so you can tell me if I'm going far afield. But chapter 2 establishes that Daniel is this kind of remarkable individual, and then chapter 3, with these other three kind of Jewish exiles, establishes that kind of that no, it is the Jewish people in general, who are under the who are devout to this high God, the God, and it is them, this people, and this God who are exceptional, not just Daniel itself.
Yeah, I think there's a decent amount of merit to that, and I think I think from a synchronic perspective, at least, we can take that kind of read on the text, and yeah, there's a certain amount of. One of the big problems, one of the big issues that Daniel's trying to tackle for its audience is identity. And what better way to solidify people and rally people to a certain cause than by, presenting the whole people, like the group by which others may identify themselves or define themselves, right? Because you don't just do identity internally, like who am I myself internally, but you also do identity as opposed to an outside other, right? And so that's certainly a big part of what's happening here, and of course the decree of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 3 is very indicative of that.
And do we actually have any sort of historical, archaeological basis to see that, Nebuchadnezzar or whoever would have been the Babylonian king at this time was, basically granting privileges or at least lifting restrictions or prohibitions or bonuses upon the Jewish people living in Babylonia at the time?
Not really. Ultimately, like for the Jews in exile, they were kind of free to, if I remember correctly, live and worship as they please, as long as they weren't being disruptive. And you see a similar kind of tack with Cyrus and his decree to send everybody home, because Cyrus ultimately, and a lot of these foreign kings, they don't care who you worship. They care more about bringing in the yearly or monthly tribute and the taxes.
Pay your taxes, and we don't care about much else.
Yeah, exactly. And so, because if you look in the Aramaic portions of Ezra, you see this exchange between the prefect who's overseeing Jerusalem and that area, and those back in Babylon, and it concerns the rebuilding of the temple, and the concern for the prefects in Jerusalem are about the storehouses of the king and damage to the taxes and whether or not they'll be able to collect them and stuff like that if they rebuild the temple. So Babylonian governance and Persian governance too, and more so Persian for the stuff in Ezra, if we can date Ezra to the late 6th or 5th or even 4th centuries BCE, is more concerned with administrative stuff, and there's minimal concern for how exactly people are worshiping and stuff like that, or what they believe in. So usually in the ancient Near East, deities and religion and faith and things like that were used by larger world empires to secure power more so than they were to provide any kind of solid gauge on what they actually believed. It was very utilitarian in nature.
Yeah. So moving forward with the narrative, so in chapter 4 we have yet another interpretation of one of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, and this one. So the thing that struck me with this chapter is that it kind of opens almost with like a formal invocation, almost like a letter that's being written in a way.
We do have some pretty blatant epistolary formulae here. So we have now. Bear in mind that the versification here is slightly different in the Hebrew or Aramaic, I should say, here than it is in the English. But where chapter 4 begins in the English is really still in chapter 3 in the Aramaic, and so we have in 3:31 in the Hebrew, but in 4:1 in the English, Nebuchadnezzar malka kol amaya umaya velishanaya. So Nebuchadnezzar the king to all the peoples and the nations and the tongues who live throughout the earth. So this is, may you have abundant prosperity. So the king is kind of making this decree in this epistolary format in this part of the narrative here.
Yeah, actually, what it was reminding me of, and just to plug the podcast that the people listening to this are already listening to. So to plug the podcast you're listening to, a previous episode of Ask Historians with Darius talking about the Sumerian Start Archives was very big on kind of saying like, yeah, there are these, these very kind of formal introductory pieces to these letters. And that's really what it kind of struck me as, is kind of hearkening back to that and echoing that. Yeah.
And this is par for the course for epistolary openings. And so you always see the sender first. And you see it. I mean, this kind of format lasted for a long time too. And so if you read through the Pauline epistles in the New Testament, it's very, very similar. So you get, Paul, a servant of Jesus, to the Christians who are in Rome, stuff like that. And you see it elsewhere in other Aramaic documents. You see it at Elephantine. You see it in Hebrew ostraca from around the same time period and even earlier. This is. Yes.
Yeah. So we have this introduction, and then we have a dream.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell us about the dream, and tell us about how Daniel gets involved.
Okay. So we get a number of issues here in chapter 4 that come to the fore, and because this is where we will need to do a little bit of historiography or deal with some of the historical data, because the dream here in chapter 4 deals with this large tree. And all these beasts of the world and creatures and birds and things like that make their home in the tree. And so again, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, as we've already seen before, right? This story is not new, but the dream this time, rather than dealing with statues, we're dealing with a tree. And this tree is huge, and it fills we can imagine it filling the whole sky. It's great and strong. Its top reaches to the heavens, and everyone can see it. And it's this beautiful, full tree that provides food for everyone. And then we get this holy watcher, this messenger kind of individual who descends from the heavens, and he cries out aloud. He says, "Cut down the tree and chop off its branches." This is in 4:14 in the English. Strip off its foliage and scatter the fruit. Let the animals flee from beneath it and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump and the roots in the ground with a band of iron and bronze in the tender grass of the field. Let him be bathed, and this is presumably Nebuchadnezzar, the antecedent for him. So let him be bathed with the dew of heaven, and let his lot be with the animals of the field in the grass of the earth. And this is where we get the real kicker here in 4:16. Let his mind be changed from that of a human, and let the mind of an animal be given to him. So basically, like, he's going to go crazy, right? He's gonna kind of go on a little rogue state, you might say, or pull a Heisenberg for those of you who are Breaking Bad fans. And let 7 times pass over him. Now, see, the problem here is that this never happened to Nebuchadnezzar, but it happened to Nabonidus. So,
and who is Nabonidus? For those of you, not of myself, of course, but those listeners who are not up on their Babylonian king lists.
Right. So, so we have Nebuchadnezzar, who is king of Babylon. We get Belshazzar in Daniel 5, which we haven't gotten to yet. Belshazzar is son of Nabonidus. Nabonidus is one of the later rulers of Babylon, post Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so we've got Nebuchadnezzar, who's the beginning of the end of the 7th century and the beginning of the 6th, and he's around for about half of the 6th century. And then we get a couple of guys who have very short reigns. We get 3. We get, for those of you who are familiar with the text, you might know the name Evil Merodach, which is, the name isn't evil, it's really Amel Marduk. And then we get Nergal Shar Utsur, we just refer to Nergal, and then we get Labashi Marduk. So these 3 guys are kind of back to back to back, reigns of 2, 4, and less than a year, respectively. And then in the middle of the 6th century, for about 17 years, we get Nabonidus. Nabonidus is the last Babylonian king over Mesopotamia, before Cyrus and the Persians come in 539. And we have a document from the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4Q Prayer of Nabonidus. And this text gives us a hint at the fact that this part of Daniel probably actually has to do with Nabonidus and not Nebuchadnezzar. We also have records from Babylon noting that Nabonidus was exiled and kind of had this time away, you could say, where he went a little off the reservation. You might say. Is that an appropriate phrase? Is that okay?
Well, I mean, just to be clear for the listeners, is that the interpretation of this, and the reason that we're focusing on Nabonidus and Nebuchadnezzar is because Daniel's interpretation is that this tree represents the royal authority of Nebuchadnezzar, and that the person who is going to go crazy and turn into an animal is Nebuchadnezzar. That is Daniel's interpretation. Right, and that all these things are going to scatter from it, but we're leaving the stump and the roots in the ground, right? Which of course is also symbolic. Yeah, it's tricky, and this plays into the genre a lot as far as this vision reporting. Again, we have more vision reporting, and the second half of chapter 4 here is where Daniel really expounds the dream. So the first half of 4, he's just reporting the dream, right? He's just saying, okay, here's what you saw, right? And then in 4:20, we get the tree that you saw, which grew great and strong, so its top reached the heaven. All this is you. So Nebuchadnezzar is the king, right? Or excuse me, Nebuchadnezzar is the king, but also the tree, right? So you have grown great and strong. Your greatness has increased and reaches to the heavens. Your sovereignty to the ends of the earth. And Daniel continues, and whereas the king saw a holy watcher coming down from the heavens and saying, cut the tree and all that stuff, you shall be driven away from human society, right? So this is with the tree being cut down, and it's kind of disjointed, isn't it? I mean, this whole dream, because it's got multiple things happening at once, where the king is the tree, but then it also kind of changes this thing where he's back to human form and is being given the heart of an animal and all this stuff. And so it's kind of polyvalent in that regard. The actual chapter ends, I believe, with this just basically saying, and then this came true.
yeah, and we see a similar thing in chapter 5, where Belshazzar is, he's killed that night, end. Right.
Yeah. So why don't we go ahead and talk about chapter 5? So we've had in the somewhat shaky historical narrative of Daniel, We have Nebuchadnezzar goes out and becomes a beast in the field, and then in chapter 5 we switch over to Belshazzar, who is I think is portrayed as like a son of Nebuchadnezzar or an inheritor of the throne, but he's ruling now at the chapter of 35.
We have no transition really. We get the end of Daniel 4. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of Heaven, blah 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 blah, which is this doxology at the end of 4 basically. And then the beginning of 5, King Belshazzar made a great festival for 1,000 of his lords. And it's like, it's like shifting into 3rd going 70 miles an hour on the highway, right? So we have complete change of scene, complete change of subject with no kind of transition or anything like that. We're not told anything about the relationship between Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar, at least in this text, if we're looking just at Daniel, right? And so we get a lot of jumping around.
Yeah, but this is the chapter where we have the very famous writing on the wall. So, what prompted this writing, and who's actually doing the writing? Because I think this is one of the more interesting places in the Bible where it's just kind of delves in. It becomes very very kind of for lack of a better word, spooky.
It is spooky. I mean, this is very Addams Family-ish, right? So Belshazzar calls this feast, and he brings all these people together. Notably, it's the way in which he's serving the feast is with all these vessels from the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. So all these gold cups and silver cups and plates and things like that, flatware. And so they're drinking wine and they're praising these idols, right? The gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. We get in 5:4, right? In 5:5, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the wall of the royal palace. So we just get these fingers. It's not even a whole hand; it's just fingers, right? So these fingers are writing on the wall of the royal palace next to a lampstand, and the king was watching. And now we are told that it's actually a hand. The king was watching the hand as it wrote. Then the king's face turned pale, and his thoughts terrified him. Of course, this is par for the course, right? The king sees a vision, at least in Daniel, and he's terrified because it probably bodes ill. And for Belshazzar, it certainly does. And so the writing on the wall, quite literally, we get mene, tekel, upharsin. Okay.
Yeah, so, Daniel gets called up to interpret this, but, I mean, are these actual words?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are Aramaic words. So let's see, we get the writing. If we skip down to 5:24. So from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed, and this is 5:25. Mene, tekel, upharsin. And I say u because u here is the conjunction in Aramaic. So mene, tekel, and parsin. And Daniel provides his interpretation. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered, because this is from the verbal root mana, meaning to count or to number. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Okay, tekel. Tekel is from, many of you may know the word shekel, which is, of course, equivalent to, it's basically the Israeli dollar, right? But tekel means to weigh. Okay, so tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting, right? And paras, the verbal word paras means to divide. Okay, so paras, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and to the Persians. So this is talking about the end of Babylonian rule in Mesopotamia.
Yeah, so Daniel's just there's been this very spooky hand comes out of nowhere, writes some words on the wall. Daniel gets called in to interpret it, does it because he's Daniel. And how does Belshazzar react to this?
Again, rewarding of Daniel. So Daniel is clothed in purple, and let's bear in mind that purple at the time was a very expensive kind of cloth to make. The dyes and the materials required for that. So this is like really nice stuff, right? This is like he's getting like a Versace suit, right? A chain of gold was put around his neck, and the proclamation was made concerning him that he should rank 3rd in the kingdom. So he's made this triumvir. You often see it translated as triumvir, this 1/3 ruler, I suppose, something like that.
He gets pretty heavily promoted in the political sphere, I guess you could very generally say.
And bear in mind, too, that so first Daniel has been rewarded and promoted by Nebuchadnezzar, right, on a couple of occasions. And then Daniel is heavily rewarded by Belshazzar, this second king of Babylon. And if we think, too, that if the beginning of the story is early on in the exile, right, presumably the early first half of the 6th century, and now we're into a second major king, and we're about to get into Darius, which is even later, Daniel's starting to get pretty old. pretty quickly. So we're going to start to run into some pretty big historical problems in that regard too.
So really what you're saying is basically just in the first, 5 chapters, we've covered, several decades essentially of time.
Oh yeah. Yeah. By the end of this thing, we have to posit if we're positing an historical Daniel, we have to posit one who's probably by the end of it close to 80 or 90.
Yeah. So chapter 5 also ends with, I guess you might say, abruptly. So go ahead and just kind of very briefly tell us what happens that, and then tell us who Darius the Mede is.
Oh yes. So the account in chapter 5, as you said, ends very abruptly, and that very night after Daniel was rewarded, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, boom, he's dead. And we get very little transition. At least we have a transition this time between 5 and 6. So the end of 5, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So we have this name, Darius the Mede. Outside of Daniel, we don't know of a Darius the Mede.
We have a King Darius of the Achaemenid dynasty, and I'm sure someone familiar with Persian history will completely correct my pronunciation there. But we do have a historical Darius.
Yeah, in Aramaic, Daryavish. I don't know. So those of you who are old Persian fanatics, don't eviscerate me. I'm just going off the Aramaic here. But yeah, so we do have a Darius of Persia, Darius the First, and Darius the First suppressed a couple of later pretenders who were claiming to be sons of Nabonidus, who was the last Babylonian king. So Darius the First puts down these claimants to the throne, and so this suppression of claimants to the throne could have been conflated with the Persian takeover of Babylon, but the problem, if we interpret Darius the Mede as Darius the First of Persia, the problem with that is that everywhere Darius the Mede of Persia comes up, he's always like, look, I'm Persian. I am Darius the Mede of Persia. And that's pretty much everywhere in the biblical text, and then also in Darius's own inscriptions. So we look at something like the Behistun inscription. And so it seems unlikely that it's Darius the First. Some people think it might be Nabonidus, but the only positive evidence for it being Nabonidus is that Nabonidus wasn't truly Babylonian in origin. He was. The third possibility that you see a lot of people suggest is this guy Gaborura, this non-Babylonian from Gutium, the northeastern quadrant of what was at the time the entire known world. And much of this section, much of this area of Gutium was comprised mostly of Media. And this guy ruled over Mesopotamia on behalf of Cyrus in a lot of ways. He appointed a lot of the satraps and things like that.
Yeah, Cyrus being the ruler of Persia at the time.
Right. So Cyrus in 540, 539-ish, Cyrus comes in and topples Babylon and takes over. And so now at this point, around 540, 539, we're talking about the Persian Empire now in Mesopotamia. And in 537, Cyrus sends everybody home. And so maybe some of our listeners went and saw the Cyrus cylinder exhibit. I myself saw it at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And this cylinder, this decree from Cyrus, basically said, okay, everybody go home and worship your own gods. And so it's kind of this, a lot of people tout it as this move of religious tolerance, but it really is, it's a very savvy political move, right? Because he sends everybody home and kind of also at the same time wins people over to his cause. So it's, quote unquote, we can put some scare quotes around the word benevolent, perhaps. And of course, this also forms the backdrop for the Book of Ezra and the rebuilding of the temple in the 6th century back in Jerusalem. And so that's Cyrus. And this Gabawura character was one of Cyrus's cronies, who was one of his kind of vice regents, you might say. And so this is another possibility. And it's possible that Darius was this guy's throne name. So that could be what's going on here with this Darius the Mede character. Ultimately, it could just be imaginary, and I realize that feels like punting, but it's also very possible because we're working with literature, right? And obviously, there's a lot of fictional stuff in Daniel, and so it wouldn't surprise me if they made up characters whole cloth to a certain extent. And two, if we think about the role of media in the biblical text more broadly conceived, you have a lot of relationship, or at least a lot of references between the Medes and the Babylonians. And so you have Isaiah, for example, Proto-Isaiah, where you get these oracles against Babylon that say that the Medes are going to come in and topple Babylon. And so it may be trying to comport to that. That's one possibility, because in the ancient world, in a lot of ways, you have this progression of world empires from Assyria to Media to Persia to Greece, chronologically. And so what could be happening is that they're just replacing Assyria with Babylon. Media follows immediately thereafter, and so the author could feel compelled to have at least one Median king.
Yeah, right? To have a kind of a callback. But I mean, at the very least, we have this Darius the Mede, who could be, one person, no person, or four people. It kind of comes in and is kind of the stand-in for saying, and then Babylon was toppled in a way. Right. He at least is that kind of signifier in the text.
Right, and with some pretty significant gaps in the narrative, right? So because we're going from Belshazzar's death to all of a sudden the kingdom was just handed to Darius as if it was that easy.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and move into chapter 6, which starts with kind of the and this is the administrative divisions we had, and but in a way to kind of just set up Daniel as some sort of high-ranking official. And for those of you playing around at home, this is where the lion din comes in. So go ahead and lead us through that.
Yeah. So Darius sets up all these satrapies, so all these little districts throughout the area over which he has governance. And again, we see our hero Daniel rising to the fore. And so in 6:3, we get, soon Daniel distinguished himself above all other presidents and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to appoint him over the whole kingdom. So again, Daniel is this Jew in the foreign court, now Median apparently, who and this Jew in this foreign court is successful again, with not as much story about his background and success here, but Daniel is basically in charge again. But we get all these other satraps and these governors and prefects and things like that who want to bring complaint against Daniel as it pertained to the kingdom and how things were going. But of course, Daniel is this, as we've seen throughout, this blameless individual who's above reproach, basically. And so you get these men accusing, we shall not find any ground for complaint against Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his own God. And so these governors and prefects, they go to Darius, and in 6:8, they go to Darius and say, now, O king, establish the interdict and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. And so, because they want this to be a permanent thing, right? They want what's about to happen to be a permanent thing. So the ordinance, this interdict here, is that whoever prays to anyone, divine or human, for 30 days, except to the king, shall be thrown into a den of lions. So they're setting Daniel up to fail, basically. This is entrapment of, it's entrapment is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, it struck me as kind of almost a little odd to be like, okay, so then we established this rule where, no one can worship for the next month. Everyone just take a month off, kind of thing. Yeah. And like that's the trap they set up for him.
Right. And not just a month off, but a month off from anybody but the king. So they can pray to the king, they can worship the king, but nobody else for the next month. And so Daniel, of course, being the devout man of Yehud that he is, does what? He prays to his own God, just as he had been doing and has been doing throughout our narrative here. And so, of course, these guys who construct this interdict, they go to Darius and they say, hey, did you look at that Daniel guy? He's breaking the rule. So, of course, Daniel then gets cast into this den of lions as a result, because this is the punishment that they had laid out in this interdict. And they seal him in the den. He's there for several days. And, of course, this is where some of our apocryphal literature comes into play. And so when we look at something like Bel and the Dragon, we get Habakkuk, who is said to have brought Daniel food while he was in the lion's den. So we get some relationship with some apocryphal literature here. But basically, Daniel is being persecuted for his piety, which for Jews in the 2nd century BCE, this would ring quite true, because we have Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who's oppressing Jews and things like that. And so this, is going to play into a little bit of the audience and things like that. But, of course, as many listeners, certainly, probably not all, but many will remember, Daniel is not destroyed by the lions, and angels are sent to shut the lions' mouths.
It would be a much shorter book at that point, yes.
Yeah, we wouldn't get the fun stuff in chapter 7 if were it not for the angels' mouths or the angel closing the mouths of the lions. And of course, we see a very similar thing. I mean, this is basically this like sub miracle. It's not necessarily a full blown miracle, but Like, it's kind of miraculous that Daniel made it out of this cave alive. And, of course, at par for the course, what happens after this miracle? The king practically gets converted. So in 426, we get this kind of doxology, right? I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people should tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. That's conversion, as far as I'm concerned.
Or at least accepting, if we are, the classic idea of monotheism versus polytheism, it's perfectly fine for a polytheist to, kind of say, yet another God, that's fine, and this one's very powerful, can, stop lions, excellent, we'll add this one into the pantheon.
Right.
There's, I guess that could be another interpretation of it is there as well, but it's definitely the idea that the recognition of the power of the Jewish God.
Right. Yeah. Oh, at the least. And the doxology in 26 and 27 is very telling, and it's very similar. I mean, these little episodes all follow kind of a very similar narrative arc, where you have this problem at the beginning of the story. Daniel gets put in some hot water, and by the end of it, the Babylonian or Persian or quote unquote Median king, right, is singing the praises, I mean, almost quite literally, of not only Daniel but also of his God.
Yeah. So moving into chapter 7, we throw it into reverse again, and I believe this is the last of the kind of considered the older chapters of Daniel.
Yeah. So if we posit that chapters 1 through 7 form an earlier stage in the book than chapters 1 through 7, basically all the Aramaic and the initial Hebrew chapter. And just as a brief aside, the reason why I include chapter 1 in this is because we don't really pick up on any antagonism towards the foreign rulers in chapter 1, which we would expect if the first Hebrew chapter were being put together with the Aramaic at the same time that the later Hebrew chapters are being put together. Because in the latter chapters, in 8 through 12, we see a lot of animosity towards foreign rulers. But we just don't see that in chapter 1. So, and I'm riffing off of Gammy again here, and so that's why I include chapter 1 with 2 through 7 with all the Aramaic. Now, this is the end of the Aramaic, chapter 7, so we get through 728, and in chapter 8 we're back to late biblical Hebrew.
Yeah, so in chapter 7 we have yet another dream, then interpretation, and that's pretty much the format for really the rest of Daniel. It's dream, interpretation, dream, interpretation, dream, interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, kind of. It gets a little weird in the latter portion of Daniel, and I haven't done as much work in 8 through 12 as I have in the Aramaic. But yeah, this one, chapter 7 tends to stand out a lot because this is where we get some full-blown apocalyptic. 8 through 12 tend to deal more with circumstances more specific to what the Maccabees are dealing with Antiochus IV. And that's couched again, and this phrase will come up again, Vaticania ex eventu, so this quote-unquote prophecy or foretelling after the fact. And what we get in the latter half of the book, or latter third of the book, I should say, is that things are accurate up to a point, and then once Antiochus IV dies, things aren't so accurate anymore. So we can kind of use that as a terminus ad quem for dating these texts. But Daniel 7 might be one of the more well-known sections, I think. This is full-blown apocalyptic. We have this vision of these beasts rising out of the sea. We have cosmic messengers. We have this one like a son of man, this Bar Enosh, Bar Enosh, and we have all this Baal imagery. We have a lot of Canaanite mythology that's made its way into this text. And this is also the first time in the Hebrew Bible where we see Yahweh depicted in old age imagery. I know a lot of people might, if you're thinking of the Hebrew Bible, and if you think of the God of the Hebrew Bible, you might imagine the Simpsons character, right? The Simpsons God, which is this long flowing white robe with a long white beard, and all you see are his knees and his shins and his hands on the armrests of his chairs, right? But really, this notion of Ancient of Days is not, this is the first time that we see him as Ancient of Days, and elsewhere Yahweh is depicted as a warrior, a youthful warrior. So I would point people to the Jason Bembry's book Yahweh's Coming of Age, where he details this phenomenon and goes through in detail all the various phrases that people often assume mean old age but actually don't.
So what's the significance of Yahweh appearing as the Ancient of Days, as is put in the text, as this old man, white robe, white beard kind of thing?
Right. What happens here is that we get the Ancient of Days, but then in the same context we get this Bar Enosh, this Son of Man, right, who's riding on this cloud, which is an epithet of Baal, the Canaanite god Baal. And so the Ancient of Days is tantamount to the Canaanite god Elyon, or the Most High. And so what we have here is, or Ale, I should say, I believe it's Ale. Ale is okay. The Ancient of Days here in Daniel 7 is basically breaking off a piece of his own divinity and ascribing it to this Bar Enosh, which is tantamount to Baal. And so we have, this is pretty blatant Canaanite mythology. And so it's partaking in this much older cultural trope of cosmogony and cosmology. So that's a big part of the significance here of Yahweh being portrayed in old age, is having this older supreme deity and this sub-deity doing the bidding of the supreme deity.
So we have this kind of hearkening back to older mythological, religious imagery, essentially, and kind of iconography and symbolism as well. But how is this interpreted? Because again, Daniel's all about dream interpretation here. How is this interpreted? That we have these four beasts, and then one of them is this overpowering beast that is then defeated by this one Son of Man or something like that, and thrown down. How is this interpreted by Daniel?
Okay, this is where it gets sticky. So the beasts, again, this is going to play into these various world empires. So we get in 7:19. Then I desired to know the truth concerning the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest. So we have these first three beasts that all have a particular look to them. Right? These are beasts of multiple heads, and there's fire and all kinds of...
Yeah, there's a lion with eagle wings and a bear and a leopard with bird wings, right, or something, and multiple heads or something. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and so this fourth beast is, as Daniel describes it here, is terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong, and had great iron teeth, and was devouring, breaking in pieces, and stamping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that preceded it, and had 10 horns. If I remember correctly, this should be Greece. And so, because the progression here, remember, we don't want to consider Rome as a part of this.
Yeah, this is all pre-Roman.
Yeah, Rome doesn't enter the scene until Pompey in 63 BCE. And so this is all pre-Pompey. So Greece is coming along. We can talk about the first beast is probably Babylon. The second beast is probably Media. The third beast is probably Persia. And the fourth beast is Greece. And these 10 horns, I believe, are going to be generals. One of the things that we have to bear in mind is that all this language is hyper symbolic. These horns are, and for some reason, the writers of Daniel like horn imagery for people, because we get it again in 8 with the goat and the ram and all this stuff, which certainly has to do with Ptolemaic and Seleucid rulers, right? So yeah, we're dealing with the progression of world empires here again in Daniel 7, and the relationship of the God of Daniel to those world empires. And so, because we get these horns and this one that speaks arrogant words, and this fourth beast is put to death, and its body is destroyed, and the rest of the beasts, they're stripped of their power, and then this one, like the human being, comes along up to the ancient one, this Ancient of Days, and this son of man, this Bar Enosh, is the one who receives dominion. Right now, Christian interpreters will interpret the Son of Man as Jesus. I am disinclined to agree with that.
Well, how would it have been for the readers of Daniel during this time of kind of the Maccabees and such? How would this have been interpreted? Who were the Maccabees thinking that this Son of Man was?
Gabriel. So we get Gabriel in the latter half directly. Most likely that Gabriel is going to be the one who is most likely to be this character, this Bar Enosh character.
And this is Gabriel's in Archangel Gabriel.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that I always like to point out when with passages like this is this text has an original audience in the 2nd century BCE in the Levant, and so this audience, right, is undergoing extreme amounts of persecution, right? Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes is defiling the temple. He sacrificed a pig on the altar and things like that. And so I asked the question, if we are to interpret the Son of Man as Jesus, what does that do for the audience of the 2nd century BCE? That's unintelligible to the 2nd century BCE because they don't know a Jesus character. And so it makes no sense. It doesn't help them whatsoever. So, it's got to be something, a character that they're familiar with and are going to be able to identify with, right? Because otherwise...
Are you saying that we don't really have that kind of, that strain of later kind of like Messianic Judaism?
I don't think that's what's going on here. What you end up getting with a lot of texts, too, is this history of interpretation, which is fine and well and good. But I think if we're talking specifically about Daniel, I think that this is one of these texts that has grown legs and has gone a far way in various directions, and largely as a function of the group who's reading the text. And that tends to always be the case. Interpretations are a function of the group reading the text. And so this is just another one of those prime examples where the identity of the Bar Enosh, of the Son of Man, is really a function of the group who's reading it. And most pertinent, though, for the audience, the original audience of this text, is going to be what is applicable in the 2nd century BCE.
And at the end of Chapter 7 is where we're going to have to leave off for this chapter of the Ask Historians podcast. We will be back in 2 weeks to bring you the thrilling conclusion of the Book of Daniel. We'll be going over chapters 8 through 12, as well as a couple books of Apocrypha, including the one about the dragon, in the next fortnight. And we'll be going over those a little less in-depth than we did here. We won't be quite going chapter by chapter, but kind of taking them more in broad strokes, so we can fit in some time talking about the historiography about interpreting the Book of Daniel as well. So I hope you'll come back and tune in for that next week. I will also just go ahead and tease you with an announcement that I will be making next week that has some slightly interesting news for the Ask Historians podcast. We'll be going up on YouTube with our episodes, so for those of you who've been asking about that, we'll be providing just let you know that we are putting episodes up on YouTube, and we're building up some very interesting and nice indexed menus. I have a new kind of behind the scenes co-host, Jaffs, who, if you recall, was interviewed on the Mongols in China a couple episodes back, and is a fellow moderator of Ask Historians. So for those of you who've been wondering what happened to our affable Antipodean Taz from Taz, the Taz man himself, so he was instrumental in getting the Ask Historians podcast started and was our original host, but sadly he was eaten by lions. No, he's fine, but real life called and he had to go take care of things. So I've as you may have noticed, I've segued into taking over the podcast and hosting for him, but I do have some behind-the-scenes help and a little extra help now. So hopefully we'll be able to start rolling out the things that I've been wanting to roll out pretty soon, and getting us up on YouTube is one of those. So we'll provide, this is kind of a soft rollout, so for those of you who made it this far in the podcast, there will be a link in the discussion post to the YouTube channel, but we'll be officially announcing it, I guess you could say, with the next episode. So for those of you who are listening right now, you privileged few. Anyway, go ahead, and if you like the episode, go ahead and let people know that you like the episode, so you can talk or argue or just kind of bliss out with other people about this. If you didn't like the episode, don't tell anyone at all. That's just general, that's just polite. So, and do review, go do Scooby-Doo things to us on iTunes, and pretty soon you'll be able to do that to us on YouTube as well. So, see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/askhistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.